everyone. I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Millard Fillmore, and the focus is national and state politics. The year is 1830, and Fillmore is operating as a state assemblyman for his local community in Aurora, New York. He's also a thriving attorney in that community. In fact, he's starting to get noticed increasingly by the legal community in nearby Buffalo. Buffalo itself, a thriving community, doing extremely well thanks to the Erie Canal, which is now up and running. Buffalo is sitting as a hub right there on Lake Erie and creating lots of opportunities, including in the law. Fillmore was starting to get noticed. He was trying some cases in Buffalo and doing well, also trying some cases at the state Supreme Court. And along came Joseph Clary, his former boss and mentor in the legal community. When he was training initially in Buffalo, he offered him a partnership. Fillmore said yes. Moved his young family to a two-story home on Franklin Street, about a block off of Main, where he would walk 6 days a week. Fillmore always took Sundays off. That was his pattern his entire life. But he pretty much a 6-day-a-week guy for the rest of the time. He was a hard worker, and he was doing extremely well, getting noticed, well-known, well-respected in the community, and his family was expanding. In addition to young son Powers, Abigail Fillmore gave birth in 1832 to a daughter. They named her Mary, but they always called her Abby. 1832 was an election year, and Fillmore was thinking maybe it's time for a change, move away from state politics and go to the national level. Set his sights on the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the Democrats pretty much were dominant, both nationally and in the state of New York at the time. Andrew Jackson is president of the United States, but not in Western New York. Western New York was still anti-Jackson, anti-Democrat. They supported the anti-Masons, of which Millard Fillmore was one. So he put his hat in the race, and he won that race, and Millard Fillmore, 1832, is off to Washington, D.C. This was a contentious time. Jackson won his re-election. He's fighting with Congress over the Bank of the United States and other economic policies. He's fighting with the state of South Carolina about it. The nullification crisis is going on, and while all this is going on, Millard Fillmore, frankly, was pretty quiet. He was not a prominent player in any of these major debates. He didn't really push any major legislation, didn't make much of an impression, and he didn't get renominated. After 2 years, he was out. His one-term congressional journey was over. He was heading back to Buffalo. Back in Buffalo, he formed a new law partnership, and he signed on with a couple of guys who would be his closest friends really for the rest of his life, Nathan Hall and Solomon Haven. Hall was the prototypical office lawyer, the best behind the scenes, researching, preparing cases, whereas Haven, he was the master of the courtroom. Fillmore rounded out the threesome. They did extremely well as a practice. They enjoyed each other's company, often out in the societal areas of Buffalo during this time together. Fillmore was a little different in that he had teaching and mentorship kind of in his own blood. Is that he was a teacher, was one of the first jobs he had ever had, and he used that with his law clerks. He spent a lot of time in the evenings with them, answering their questions, giving them counsel, trying to help them become successful lawyers in the future. 1836 rolls around, it's another election year, and he's thinking maybe it's a chance to get back in the ring. And there's been a pretty significant change in politics nationally with the advent of the Whig political party, a true national party to challenge the Democrats. And Fillmore, never a Democrat, very much aligned with the Whigs, and he was thinking about running again for Congress. Once again, Democrats in charge mostly at the national and state levels. You've got Henry Clay representing the Whigs at the presidential contest in 1836, going up against Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren wins that race, and the Democrats continue to do well in both houses of Congress, but the Whigs do pick up a few seats. One of them goes to a gentleman in Western New York by the name of Millard Fillmore. After a 2-year hiatus, he's heading back to Washington, D.C. So it's March of 1837. Van Buren is inaugurated as President of the United States, and within a couple of months, the economy tanked. The panic of 1837 kicked in. Andrew Jackson's economic policy is really causing this. What he had done in terms of the Bank of the United States, partly taking the federal funds out of the bank to accelerate the demise of the bank, putting that in state banks, what they called pet banks. That led to over-speculation by the pet banks, and this was a part of the reason for the crash. In addition to Jackson's specie circular, there wasn't enough specie to pay for the public lands. This was an economic problem, but Martin Van Buren was going to stay the course. He was going to keep going with Jackson's policies. He did call a special session of Congress to debate this, but he announced at that special session he really wasn't all that open to making any changes. He was going to go with a tough love approach and to let the economy kind of work itself out. The Democrats really pounced. This was a bickering-oriented special session, and Millard Fillmore got involved. He gave a speech on September 25th of 1837, placing the blame of all this malaise in the economy on those pet banks. Fillmore said banks have been granted and the stocks distributed to party favorites as a reward for party services. They have been the mercenary bribe offered to the community to sap the foundations of moral honesty and political integrity. The result was all the evils of overbanking, overtrading, ruinous gambling, and the final derangement of the currency and the bankruptcy of the government. This was sort of the tone of this special session, bickering back and forth. Very little was accomplished, and the panic, frankly, continued throughout most of Van Buren's term. Finally, heading into the election year of 1840, it was another topic that became prominent, and it's a topic that the United States had dealt with for some time, and it was the topic of slavery. The fact that Texas was sitting out there as an independent republic, that some wanted to annex into the Union, brought this question about slavery expansion into Texas into the question. People also still questioning about views of other parts of the country on slavery where it already existed in the existing states. So politicians were being asked about this constantly, and for the first time, Millard Fillmore weighed in. He gave the following response: "I think Congress has no power over the subject in the several states. That the Constitution has expressly guaranteed to the states all power not guaranteed to the general government, and this not being granted and consequently prohibited from attempting to exercise it. We may sympathize with the suffering slave. We may pity the folly of a people who entail poverty upon their state by establishing an institution that deprives it of half its productive labor, but this is all we can do. The Constitution guarantees this right, and that instrument is too sound to be violated for any cause whatever." Millard Fillmore was completely consistent on this throughout his entire career. The Constitution came first. It sanctioned slavery. Slavery was going to persist in his mind because the Constitution needed to persist, and that was his perspective that he carried throughout his entire political career. Well, things took a turn. Back to state politics, where Thurlow Weed, who had helped Fillmore get involved in politics in the first place, he had also signed on now with the Whigs, and he was working with the new governor of New York, William Seward. They wanted Fillmore to leave Congress and run for the State Comptroller position. This was the top economic position in state politics in New York, and it came with lots of patronage opportunities, which is what we really cared about. You win elections, you get jobs to help people win more elections. But this was not what Millard Fillmore wanted. He didn't want this position. He wanted to stay in Congress, and he did a pretty bold thing where he barked back at his political boss and said no. He wrote a strongly worded letter back to Weed that said that such a move would utterly ruin all my professional prospects and leave me at the end of 3 years' hard labor without honor or profit in what I regard as the most dreadful of all situations, dependent upon the caprices of a political party for official favors, for the support of myself and my family. I cannot endure the thought of it. I made up my mind when I entered political life to never go so far as to feel for a moment that I depended upon any office or any popular favor for a livelihood. That moment I should lose my independence, I fear my integrity. His is miserable whose happiness hangs on princes' favors. I cannot become a slave to such a master. This was something that Thurlow Weed did not care for. He reacted very angrily at this. Again, he was a political boss. He had helped Fillmore get involved in politics. The way the game was played is if the boss says you run for this office or that office, you go along. And for the long term, this is how the game would work with the machine operation, something like Weed had put into place. But Fillmore balked. He didn't want to be aligned with that. He was more interested in his own independent integrity than to be the pawn in the party political system. So he said no. There would be ramifications. This letter, one of the most strongly worded that Fillmore ever wrote, also would have significant political consequences. It would create a rift between him and Weed and with Seward, and this would last and be impactful really for the rest of his political career. But those are stories for another day. That is Millard Fillmore and national and state politics from the life of Millard Fillmore. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.